Today is Sunday, March 6th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And I wanted to take some time today to answer a question that I received this morning from a very friendly woman who said she was a secular Carmelite, I believe, and she wanted to know how, given how diligently I have promoted a return to classical Catholic education, how I can also promote the modern liturgy of the hours. And I've gotten this question quite a bit. Usually on social media, I get criticized for it. How can I promote classical Catholic education, a return to the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and so on, and yet not at the same time promote traditional Latin Mass and the traditional divine office and so on? Why does there seem to be this disconnect between what I teach and promote with regard to academics and what I promote and personally practice with regard to devotion and prayer and worship? And I'd like to talk about this a little bit because I think it's an important question. And like I said, I've been asked this quite a bit, so I can see why people looking in from the outside would see this as some kind of contradiction or apparent contradiction. I had one guy on social media accuse me of some kind of gross cognitive dissonance in the way that I promote classical Catholic education and then practice the modern liturgical devotions and worship of the Church. So let me explain. First of all, it needs to be understood that I was a classicist before I was a Catholic. I started studying the classics, classical liberal arts studies, classical Greek and Roman philosophy and civilization in 1995 when I began these studies, and I switched from pre-med studies at Rutgers University to classical studies. I started my classical studies in 1995, and I didn't become a Catholic until 2005. That's when I reverted to the Church, but it was really like a conversion because my childhood was only nominally Catholic for a few years. But I was a classicist and a historian first, and then I became a Catholic. My studies as a classicist, my major in college was actually classics and ancient history. And I pursued those studies because of my desire to be able to study sacred scripture. I wanted to understand classical Greek. I wanted to understand ancient Near Eastern history, and the degree program at Rutgers, combined with independent study that I was permitted to do, gave me the opportunity to make a good use of the resources that were available at Rutgers and at Princeton, because I also had access to the Princeton Library and collections there, to get an education that would equip me for biblical studies, which was my interest at that time. So I was immersed in classical studies. At the time, I was a Protestant, and my inclinations led me to Episcopalianism. I wasn't interested in modern fundamentalism. I wasn't interested in Calvinism, or what's called, well, let me just say Calvinism. I'll leave it there. I wasn't interested in that sort of do whatever you want Christianity, me and the Bible. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in orderly liturgical Christianity. And that led me, as a Protestant, to Episcopalianism, which I very much enjoyed. I was very comfortable as a classicist in the Episcopal Church in the United States. I considered myself to be a classical Anglican. And there are many Anglican classicists and historians that I respected. Many Anglican clergy members that I respected from history. And I was very comfortable, but I was uncomfortable with the question of authority. And that's what ultimately forced me to convert to Catholicism. So, if you understand the background in my own spiritual life and academic life, you'll see that I was a classicist first. And I was immersed in ancient and classical studies, languages, history, philosophy, and so on, as my Christian life developed. And so, even as an Anglican, I was already familiar with the rule of Saint Benedict. I was already familiar with the writings of the Church Fathers. I was already a fan of Saint Augustine. I was already reading John Cassian. I was also already participating in liturgical prayer. In the Anglican Church, we celebrated with the Book of Common Prayer, which I enjoyed both at church and at home. And I also learned about the Anglican Breviary, the Anglican prayer book, which is sort of an Anglican version of the Divine Office. I had all of these things and was already practicing with these resources before I became a Catholic. And one of the things that's important about real Protestantism, not modern evangelicalism, which is really just crazy, but real Protestantism is that it looks back to the apostolic age as the source of true Christianity. And so when I talk about traditional Christianity, I think of the apostles, the scriptures. I think of first century Christians, early martyrs, early church fathers, the ante-Nicene or pre-Nicene fathers of the church. Even when I was in college, I was already studying early Christian writings, the writings of Polycarp and Justin Martyr. So I had an idea of ancient Christianity, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Christianity, up to the reforms, we could say, of Saint Benedict, as he established monasticism and the rule of life that really became the foundation for European Christian culture. He's sometimes called the father of European culture. I was familiar with all of that. I was already a fan of ancient Christian culture, but I was so as an Anglican. It was the issue of authority in the church that forced me to become a Roman Catholic, because I could not remain outside of the Catholic Church with a good conscience. I believed that Jesus Christ came into the world to establish a visible church. That's one of the reasons why I was attracted to Anglicanism rather than Puritanism or Calvinism in the first place. I knew that Christ came into the world to establish a visible church. And I couldn't get around the weakness of the Anglican argument that the King of England was the head of the church in England. That was just such a ridiculous argument to me, that the political leader is, because of his secular power, therefore also the ecclesiastical leader. That's just ridiculous. Makes no sense at all. Was impossible for me to embrace, and I knew that it was just a matter of time as I was in the process of learning about Roman Catholicism. And once I got into the study and meditation of the primacy of St. Peter and the really clear teachings in the Gospels of Peter's primacy and the order of the visible church, I had to become a Roman Catholic. And so I became a Roman Catholic because of the doctrine of the papacy, because of the primacy of St. Peter. That's why I became a Roman Catholic. Before I even considered any other Catholic issues, I became a Catholic because of the question of the papacy. So I came into the Catholic Church as a classicist, steeped in classical studies, ancient history, sacred scripture, and early Christian writings. Now, when I came into Catholicism, I came in ready to submit myself to the authority of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. I understood that that was necessary, and those were the conditions under which I entered the Church. Any argument, therefore, against the papacy, to me, is just absurd nonsense. If there is no authoritative papacy, if there's no authoritative hierarchy, if there's no visible head of a visible church, if there's no visible hierarchy of the Catholic Church, if there's no living authority, living magisterium, we just have Protestantism. If we reduce Christianity to some kind of invisible church battle among scholars for who can come up with the most clever arguments, we're just all Protestants. We may not call ourselves Protestants, but the essential principle of Protestantism is the denial of a visible church, a denial of a visible supreme ruler of such a visible church. That's the essential principle of Protestantism. It's a protest against the papacy, against the idea of an authoritative living magisterium. The reason why Henry V broke away from Rome was because the Pope would not authorize the divorce of his wife and his remarriage. His protest was against the authority of the living Pope. That's what Protestantism is. So once you can get into all the details of Protestantism, what they actually believe, what they actually teach, what they actually do, all of that is water downstream. The place where the separation occurs is where they deny the authority of a living hierarchy of a visible church, and of course the papacy as the supreme ruler of the Catholic Church, which is taught explicitly in the Catechism of the Church. The magisterium is not something that existed back in the past. The magisterium is not something that was decided upon by certain members of the hierarchy at a certain time in history. The magisterium rests with the living Pope and bishops in union with the Pope. It is a living, visible authority in matters of faith and morals. I became a Catholic because I believe in the Catholic Church. I believe in the authority of the Pope and bishops in union with the Pope, a living magisterium. Now, when I enter into Catholicism, what I hear are groups of Catholics talking about tradition. They complain about reforms in the modern church. I hear them complaining about the Second Vatican Council, for example. I hear them complaining about the reforms and the Novus Ordo Mass. I hear them complaining about the reforms of the divine office and the publication of what we now refer to as the Liturgy of the Hours. And I hear these complaints, and the argument are basically that we can't change tradition. We can't abandon ancient Christianity for something new. That's the argument. Now, for most people, for most Catholics living today, and let's be honest, most Catholics living today aren't exactly ancient historians. For most Catholics living today, when they talk about tradition and ancient Catholicism, what they're really referring to is Catholicism before the Second Vatican Council. Their talk about tradition and the history of the Christian liturgy and so on, they're talking about what was in place before the Second Vatican Council. But we have to realize that the Second Vatican Council was in the 1960s. What was in place before the Second Vatican Council was not ancient Christianity. It was in itself a modern form of Christianity. It was several hundred years old. We call it the Tridentine Latin Mass, for example, because Tridentine refers to the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent took place at the time of the Protestant Reformation. So anything called Tridentine refers to the time of the Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 1500s. I believe the Council of Trent, it took place over a period of time, but I think we could say like 1550 is a good date, a good ballpark date that's easy to remember for the Council of Trent. So when we talk about anything Tridentine, we're not talking about anything ancient. We're not talking about anything classical. We're barely talking about anything medieval. Because the Council of Trent, just think about it, the Council of Trent took place after Columbus discovered the New World. That's usually set as the turning point between medieval and modern history. The Council of Trent took place after the New World was discovered. It's actually in modern history. So a Tridentine anything is modern. It's not medieval, it's not ancient, not classical. It's modern itself. It took place in the 16th century, after the discovery of the New World. But it's older than the Second Vatican Council, hundreds of years older than the United States of America. And I suppose that seems very old. But to any historian, that's not old at all. That's modern history itself. So remember, for me, coming into Catholicism as a classicist who studies ancient history, who has studied ancient Christian writings from the first few centuries of the Church, hearing Catholics refer to the Council of Trent as some kind of ancient tradition is ridiculous. The Council of Trent is an example of decisions made by a living magisterium, by a living, visible church. Therefore, I completely embrace the Council of Trent and everything that was done at the Council of Trent, but I embrace it as the work and judgment of the living hierarchy of the Church in the 16th century, in that context of revolution, philosophically and ecclesiastically in Europe at that time. There was much more going on than just the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was just a part of the massive cultural revolution that was taking place at that time. I would even argue that it's not even the most important part of that revolution. The bigger part was the scientific revolution being led by people like René Descartes and Francis Bacon, which I talk about all the time. So there were two parts of that revolution: a philosophical revolution outside the Church and an ecclesiastical and theological revolution inside the Church. And the Council of Trent addressed that ecclesiastical and theological revolution, not the philosophical revolution outside. But the Council of Trent and anything called Tridentine dates back only to the mid-1500s. Any reference, therefore, to ancient tradition certainly can't have its origin in the Council of Trent. Now, we can say, well, this Mass and this liturgy dates back well before the Council of Trent. That may be true, but it's called Tridentine for a reason, and that's because it was established as the official liturgy of the Church at the Council of Trent. There were others. There were other liturgies practiced in the Church before the Council of Trent, and they were all lawful. The Council of Trent clarified and established one particular liturgy as the liturgy of the Church in the 16th century, in modern history. So let's keep all that in perspective. When I talk about early Christianity or ancient tradition, I don't think about the Council of Trent. I think about that as a great example of the modern living authority of the Pope and bishops in union with the Pope, of the living magisterium at a certain point in history, in modern history. Anything Tridentine, like I said, has to do with the 16th century. Now, if we want to talk about ancient tradition, and let's focus on the topic of this talk, which is actually the Liturgy of the Hours. That was what the question that I received was primarily concerned with. Why would I promote classical Catholic education and at the same time, as I do, pray the Liturgy of the Hours rather than some older divine office? My response to that would be, look, the divine office was really developed by Saint Benedict. If we want to talk about an ancient, traditional divine office, we need to talk about Saint Benedict in the 500s, in the 6th century, not the Council of Trent in the 16th century. We need to talk about the 6th century. We need to talk about Saint Benedict, the rule of Saint Benedict. In the rule of Saint Benedict, you can see chapter after chapter where he is discussing the order and arrangement of the recitation of the Psalms and prayers to be recited by the monks and nuns of the Benedictine monasteries. That would be an ancient traditional divine office. And that ancient divine office, that Benedictine divine office, is still in practice today. You can go to Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma, and if you go there, you will find that the monks at Clear Creek Abbey, along with the nuns, are reciting the original divine office of Saint Benedict. This is still in practice today. This is what we might call traditional Benedictine worship and devotion. This is still in practice. So imagine going to Clear Creek Abbey and talking about the quote-unquote traditional divine office and referring to something developed after the Council of Trent or at the time of the Council of Trent. It's ridiculous. That's not the ancient divine office anyway. That's a modern divine office. If we're going to talk about the ancient divine office, let's talk about the Benedictine divine office that's still in use. We see this, as I said, at Clear Creek Abbey. And you can find it in traditional Benedictine monasteries throughout Europe. You can actually hear this divine office, the ancient Benedictine divine office, chanted every day if you go to baruchant.com. Look it up on Google. Barroux. Barroux chant. I believe it's .com, maybe .org. But you can go check it out. You can go online. There's a site, I think it's divinumofficium.com. It may be Officium Divinum, I'm not sure, I don't remember, but one of those. And you can see that they have the divine offices from all through church history. There isn't one ancient divine office. There are many different developments in the history of the divine office. So to go back to a certain point and say, aha, this is the real, that's ridiculous. That's not how it works. The church has continually, from the beginning, worked to develop and reform the divine office based on changing circumstances within and outside the church. That's what the living hierarchy of the church does. And just as reforms were made at the Council of Trent, with everything that we call Tridentine, reforms were also made at the Second Vatican Council. It's not something new, it's not something different, not something radical. It's another point in history where reforms were made under the direction of the hierarchy of the church. The Council of Trent and all that it did is based on the same exact authority as the Second Vatican Council and everything that it did. It's the same authority. So it makes no sense to appeal back to a certain council or to a certain period of time and say, that's real Catholicism. That denies the living authority of the church, which is Catholicism. So the reason why I pray the Liturgy of the Hours is not because I have to. It's not because every other form of the divine office is evil. That's not true. The church has spoken very clearly on what's permitted and not permitted. As I said, at Clear Creek Abbey, with the approval of the bishop there in Oklahoma, who actually invited them to build their monastery there, they have permission in the church to celebrate that ancient Benedictine liturgy. And it's beautiful. And I love it. And I'm very attracted to it because of my attraction to ancient Christianity. That's permitted in the church. Nothing wrong with that. At the Council of Trent, the liturgy was reformed and things were made more concrete in the Catholic Church. Things were centralized so that there was less variety and confusion throughout the Catholic Church at that point in time. And everything we call Tridentine was approved and given to the church by the hierarchy of the church, by that Council of Trent. And the church today has clearly explained what it considers acceptable and not acceptable with regard to the use of things that were produced and recommended at the Council of Trent. The same authority that established those things can also change those things. At the Second Vatican Council, the divine office was reformed. The Mass, the liturgy of the Mass, was reformed by the same authority that presided over the Council of Trent and every other council. The council of the living hierarchy of the visible church established by Christ, the successors of the apostles. The Liturgy of the Hours was the result of the Second Vatican Council and is recommended as the official liturgical prayer of the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council, in the circumstances of modern life for which the Second Vatican Council was conducted and intended to address. The reason why the changes come is not because the church is changing. It's not because the doctrine or the faith and morals of the church are changing. Anyone who says that is wrong. The church itself is not changing. Christianity is not changing. But Christianity goes back to the teaching of Christ, the teaching of the Scriptures, the teaching and tradition of the apostles, which was delivered to the hierarchy of the church to preserve forever. That's why Pope Francis's recent document was titled "The Keepers of the Tradition." That authority rests with the Pope and bishops in union with the Pope, not with laymen, not with anybody who can create a YouTube channel, not with anybody who goes to college and gets a theology degree. That authority to interpret tradition rests with the keepers of the tradition, and that's the hierarchy of the Church. There's no questioning the hierarchy of the Church. It's funny because I've been in discussions where I've articulated this and have had Catholics respond and call me an ultramontanist. And they think that they're clever because they have a name for someone who says that the Church hierarchy has authority in these matters and no one else. No quote-unquote theologians who are just academics. They have no authority in the interpretation of tradition or of Scripture. That authority was given to the Pope and bishops in union with the Pope. Not any bishop, bishops in union with the Pope. And I've had these people call me an ultramontanist, as if this is some clever term for a Catholic who is confused about church doctrine. The problem with the term ultramontanist is that that term was coined by Protestants who used it to criticize Catholics at the time of the Reformation. Anyone who appealed to the authority of the Church was called an ultramontanist. So to have Catholic people walking around calling other Catholics ultramontanists just reveals that they don't know the history of that term or where that term came from. It's like calling a Catholic a papist. No duh. Of course I'm a papist. I'm a Catholic. You can't accuse a Catholic of some kind of error because he believes in the authority of the hierarchy of the Church. That's the whole point of Catholicism. And I know that there are Catholics today who can't grasp this concept. But that's the whole foundation of Catholicism, that there is a Pope and hierarchy that is visible and living, and the authority to interpret tradition has been given to this Pope and bishops in union with him. Living hierarchy. That means there are fellow men alive in our generation who possess this authority. You don't have to be dead to have authority in the Church. There's no certain point at which there was authority in the Church, and after that point, there's no more living authority. Another argument that's raised is that the modern hierarchy has contradicted or rejected what past popes and bishops established. That is, they have disobeyed or rejected the judgments of the hierarchy in the past. But this is not a demonstrative argument. This is simply an accusation that comes down to interpretation again. So you're just back at the beginning. You're going to have an argument about interpretation, and questions of interpretation in matters of tradition lie with the hierarchy of the Church. And so there is no arguing against this. There is a living hierarchy in the Catholic Church. To say this hierarchy contradicts that hierarchy demands proof. And there's no way for anyone to demonstratively prove that accusation. It's just Protestantism. This is what Protestants do with the scriptures. They say, well, this Catholic doctrine is repugnant to Scripture. But they don't demonstrate that it is necessarily repugnant to Scripture. They simply show that they have a different interpretation, and they pretend that their interpretation of that same passage of Scripture that's found in the Catholic Church. It's the same argument that's made today in these. The second version of the divine. Promote the current of website. And those are some of the reasons why I am willing to promote the Liturgy of the Hours in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I am not interested in promoting quote-unquote traditional liturgy. I'm not interested in promoting the traditional divine office because there are troublesome groups in the church who make a big deal of the traditional liturgy and misrepresent the actual teaching of the Catholic Church. And I don't want to be associated with those groups. The existence of those groups makes me not interested in taking any space on our website or in any of our resources to promote a traditional form of prayer or worship, because I don't want to give an appearance, I don't want to even give the opportunity to anyone to accuse me of being a friend of this group or that group and all of this divisive nonsense that exists in the modern church. I'm not going to go into that. I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want a bishop, for example, to visit the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website and see anything that might lead him to have a mistaken understanding of the purpose of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and that's why I don't do it. But I do promote the Liturgy of the Hours because I pray it myself. I enjoy it very much, and it is the official liturgical prayer of the Catholic Church today. And that's why I feel comfortable promoting it and supporting it in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I don't believe that any argument that we should promote the quote-unquote ancient divine office makes any sense, because like I said, if there is an ancient divine office, it would be the divine office of Saint Benedict, which is prayed in some Benedictine monasteries, or it would simply be the book of Psalms itself in the sacred scriptures. So any appeal to antiquity would not lead us to something produced by the Council of Trent, which took place in modern history itself. So that's why, in a nutshell. Now, how does this relate to the classical liberal arts and classical Catholic education? Well, let me just put it this way. Before I said, at the Council of Trent, the Church addressed the ecclesiastical and theological revolution that was underway, led by men like Martin Luther and John Calvin. The Church addressed church issues at the Council of Trent. It didn't address philosophical issues that were being turned upside down at that same time in history. Now, from the earliest years of the Catholic Church through to the time of St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th and 13th centuries, something of a Platonic, pre-Aristotelian philosophy was popular in the Catholic Church. There were reasons why Aristotelian philosophy wasn't embraced, largely due to misinterpretation of it by non-Catholics, especially Arab philosophers. St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas worked to demonstrate to the Catholic Church that the philosophy of Aristotle, once separated from its false interpreters, actually presented a perfect philosophy that was in harmony with Catholic theology. Aristotelian philosophy was established by St. Thomas Aquinas and by and in scholastic theology and scholastic philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy was established as the official philosophical system of the Catholic Church. At the Council of Trent, the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, the scholastic theology of Thomas Aquinas, was consulted as an authority. Scholastic philosophy is the official philosophy of the Catholic Church, an Aristotelian Catholic philosophy. Attack at the time of the Scientific Revolution, which took place at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. The Council of Trent addressed the Protestant Reformation, but didn't address the Scientific Revolution. And you know about all the controversy with Galileo and all the stuff that was going on at that time. And reason, not on divine revelation. And that's why the Church didn't get into that in the Council of Trent. It left it to the philosophers, to the scholastic philosophers who refute false doctrine and defend the teaching of the Church. The scientific revolution led to the overthrow of scholastic philosophy throughout Europe and into America, as America was settled at that time. Ever since the founding of America, this modern anti-Catholic, anti-Aristotelian scientific philosophy of Francis Bacon and René Descartes has been the official philosophy of the modern world. And scholastic philosophy has largely been abandoned and lost. In the 1800s and early 1900s, Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius X called for the restoration of this ancient Christian philosophy. That's actually the title of an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII on the restoration of Christian philosophy. You can look it up. And in that document, Pope Leo XIII, in the mid to late 1800s, calls for a recommitment, a revival and restoration of scholastic philosophy in the modern Catholic Church. The modern Church called for the restoration of scholastic philosophy, and this was repeated by Pope Pius X. Unlike matters of faith and morals, unlike liturgical questions, questions of philosophy don't lie with the authority of the Catholic Church. They're left to demonstration, to disputation among philosophers. The scholastic philosophy that was established by Thomas Aquinas most famously has never been refuted or proven obsolete. It can't be replaced by modern scientific or inductive philosophy. It's been replaced simply by a rejection of it by an anti-Catholic culture that's dominated secular society since the 1500s. Scholastic philosophy has simply been abandoned by Catholics in disobedience to the exhortations of popes to restore it and commit to it. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I take up this work of restoring Christian philosophy. I take up this work of restoring the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy. I take up this work of restoring the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. And not just the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas in a work like the Summa Theologica, but all of his other philosophical teaching, his commentaries and expositions of the works of Aristotle, his complete teaching and demonstration of philosophy for Christian people. That's the mission of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. That's why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I promote ancient Catholic education, the classical Catholic curriculum. But there's no contradiction between that and the recitation of the modern liturgy of the hours. There's no conflict there. I can say that with certainty because I actually live and practice the two of them together. Academically, I study and teach the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy, Catholic theology, and I also recite the liturgy of the hours. There's no conflict between these two things. Because the scholastic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the classical liberal arts, have never been reformed by the authority of the church, and we've never been told to move from those to something else. We're left by the church to direct education ourselves as laymen. That's the vocation of the laity. In fact, when I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, before I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, the first thing I did was I wrote a letter to our bishop and asked for permission to do what I intended to do. And I was invited in to the diocesan office. I sat down with the bishop's vicar of education. I explained to him my goals for the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and what I intended to do. He went back to consult with the bishop and discuss things. We had another meeting, and I was blessed, encouraged to go for it. Not only was I encouraged to start the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I was encouraged to consider starting an independent private school in the diocese. Nothing but support and encouragement from the bishop. The church in no way is opposed to classical Catholic education. It's a mission of the laity. And as a member of the laity, I was encouraged and blessed to go for it and pursue it. And I've now run the Classical Liberal Arts Academy for over 14 years without any issue ever from any clergy or bishop, not only my bishop, but any bishop, anywhere. I've had nothing but encouragement and support. So while it may seem radical, it's within Catholic life, Catholic faith and morals. It's within the approval of the Catholic Church. There's nothing conflicting between classical Catholic education and the living hierarchy of the Church. There's nothing conflicting between the promotion of the Novus Ordo Mass in the modern world and the promotion of the Liturgy of the Hours in the modern world and the promotion of classical Catholic education in the modern world. There's no conflict between these things. I wish that Catholics who embrace these ideas of traditional Catholicism would learn more about the history of the Church with regard to education. I understand that they get into all kinds of historical studies and wranglings about historical events, and this person said this and that and this and that. That's really not profitable, because again, if any argument comes down to a matter of interpretation, it's over with the Church. Prove anything in historical arguments, because just a little bit of reasoning here. Any argument where the is the certainty of his fact that you fact, because that's the whole question, whether or not it is fact. But if someone makes an assertion about history, how can you demonstrate that to be true? By pointing to a history book? That's not demonstration. How can you demonstrate that some individual event is absolutely certain? If you can't do so, then any argument deduced from that historical assertion is otherwise not certain, not demonstrative. And that's why you cannot prove these positions from historical assertions. Look at a book, and I didn't read this book. I never would read a book like this. But if you look at a book like Taylor Marshall's Infiltration, you have foundations, historical verify absolute certainty of also absolutely certain you could argue or argue Vatican Council certain. That's what demonstration is. When someone is accused of a crime, if our courts are at least the accusations are completely ignored. It doesn't matter how strongly anyone believes a certain person is guilty. It doesn't matter how likely it seems a person is guilty. A person who is accused of a crime will be innocent until the accusers can demonstrate. There's a reason for that. The guilt needs to be demonstrated. The burden of proof is not on the person accused to prove that he didn't do everything that anyone accuses him of. The burden of proof is always on the accuser. And in these cases where popes and bishops are accused of all kinds of evil, the only acceptable argument is a demonstrative argument. One that proves, like modern courts say, without any shadow of a doubt, that the person has in fact done this or that. And those kinds of arguments are not what we find in these circles, coming from these people like Taylor Marshall and Michael Voris. I've had discussions with folks in this crowd. Flood of all kinds of historical information. Flood, just line after and argument you make or historical assertion you make, you thing. You're just pumping out this mountain, this constant flood of historical assertions, accusations, and statements from different sources, demonstrated to be absolutely certain. Book after book, video after video of historical assertions, none of which are demonstrative. And I know that most people don't understand this because they don't take the time to study the art of reasoning. But these arguments are not demonstrative. They're sophistical. They give evidence of reasonableness, but they are not proof. They are not demonstrative. To teach the classical Catholic curriculum, promote, require the recommendations of the living hierarchy of the Church. I promote the Liturgy of the Hour. The Reformed Divine Office recommended by the Second Vatican Council. I recite it myself every day. I recommend it to my students and families who I work with. I'm a member of the Third Order of St. Dominic. I see religious communities all over the world of the hours. I have no objection to this recommendation from the Church. At the same time, I have been encouraged by modern popes like Leo XIII and Pius X to restore scholastic philosophy, and I've even been encouraged and supported by my own living bishop in the Church to do the same. There's no conflict between obedience to the living hierarchy of the Church and promotion of classical Catholic education. No conflict between promoting classical Catholic education and promoting the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. There's no conflict between these two things. I would argue, as I wrap this talk up, I would argue that the conflict actually exists in fighting for things established by the Council of Trent and pretending to have some kind of commitment to a timeless, unchanging, ancient tradition. There's no such thing. When we look at the liturgy of the church, it's been constantly changing, and you can follow one stream perhaps and say this one stream has been relatively unchanged. But before the Council of Trent, all streams were committed. That argument doesn't work. Just one stream in the church. The Council of Trent established the quote-unquote Tridentine Mass and the Divine Office published at that time, which required clarification because there were so many options available and there was confusion. And as the Protestant Reformation broke out, the church wanted to these loose in order to neutralize Catholic worship and teaching. And they did that. But the conflict is to pretend that to maintain the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, one has to stick forever to the Council of Trent. That's unbelievable. Makes no sense. They don't even relate to each other. The Second Vatican Council has to do with reforming the church in its actual practices in the world. And if you don't think the world is changing, if you're going to make the argument that nothing has changed and therefore the church has no need of change, you're going to contradict yourself in 1,000 different ways. Are you honestly going to say that you're living the same life that people were living in the 1580s? Are you honestly going to say that there are no new dangers and influences outside the church today? Nothing new that didn't exist before the Second Vatican Council? Honestly, make that argument? Your life contradicts that. Your life is a completely different life than people lived in the Catholic Church at the time of the Council of Trent. Your life contradicts your argument in 1,000 different ways. And in the Second Vatican Council, the Church is working to make sure, as these changes take place outside the Church continues to serve the people of God as a nurturing mother. That's what the Second Vatican Council was for, and that's what the Second Vatican Council has done. Democracy is new since the Council of Trent. Are you going to argue that democracy hasn't changed life? There was no democracy at the time of the Council of Trent. Democracy is new. Chemical contraception, safe and sterile medical abortion is new. Wasn't available at the time of the Council of Trent, wasn't addressed in the Catechism of the Council. The opportunity to have church services online is a new dilemma that the church has to deal with. The ability to record video and audio and how this relates to the teaching and the ministry of priests and bishops and the Pope himself. There are many complex, confusing issues in the modern church, and the church continues to work to guide us through these complex issues and to pretend like nothing has changed and that we can just continue doing what was recommended by the church in the 1560s I just really don't think that that's a carefully examined argument. I understand the emotional attachment to the nostalgia of old forms of worship. You may have a cultural preference, but my argument is that those preferences are still accepted in the church, but you've got to make sure that you submit to the restrictions placed upon them by the hierarchy. The church hasn't destroyed or banished the Latin Mass, and people who say that are liars. Pope Francis didn't outlaw the Latin Mass. Anybody who says that is intentionally exaggerating what the Pope actually said. The Latin Mass is still permitted in any church by any group that has permission to celebrate it from the bishop. Do you think that that's asking too much? What kind of group gets disapproved by a bishop? Maybe they should take the relationship with the bishop more seriously. When I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I went to the bishop and sought permission. I didn't see that as some kind of oppression or denial of my rights or some kind of violation of my conscience. I wanted to make sure that I had the approval of my bishop because I'm a Catholic. I know that I needed the approval of my bishop, but I wanted it nonetheless because I want to be able to work with a good conscience. So there's no conflict whatsoever between promoting classical Catholic education, scholastic philosophy, the classical liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, with the modern liturgy of the hours. I hope that's a clear and complete explanation of where I stand on these issues and why I think they are in perfect harmony. If you'd like to get into any of these discussions, I'm open to all of these discussions. You simply need to contact me, send me an email. If you think